Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the NWA Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The NWA Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrence and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to NucleCast. Of course, as always, we have a great episode for you today. And as always, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have a great guest. Dr. Zachary Davis is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Labs, and he has been all over government, served in the IC and on Capitol Hill and at the White House. He's got a lot of great experience. So, Zach, thanks for joining us on this episode of NucleCast.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So we were talking before the show about our discussion today, and you had mentioned that you think we might be at an inflection point in global politics, in the geostrategic environment, where what we thought was sort of our standard norm or would hold to be true may no longer be true. Could you start us off by telling us what you mean and what you think's going on in the international environment?
Yeah, sure. Historians generally, look at our, human history in sort of two ways. There's the lumpers and the splitters, right? So this is the way John Lewis Gaddis talked about the Cold War, and the splitters are the people who know a whole lot about something very specific, right? So this is the forest and trees kind of question, and the lumpers are the people who take this very broad, geostrategic view and look back at human history and try and lump together big eras, right? So this is your Toynbees and the, Samuel Huntingtons and the, broad scope of history. And so I think I would fall into that sort of lumper category in viewing the circumstances today as of being of really historic proportions. That is, we're leaving something behind and entering something new, and it's something that has the proportions, that has the scope, that in the long view of history will stand out as a real turning point, an inflection point. And so we're moving from something that we thought we understood to something that is entirely new, and it doesn't have many sort of precedents. So, Westphalian, the way we think about the international system and world order, and the way that we developed our nuclear theories in the context of this bipolar Cold War distribution of power and the struggle between the United States and Soviet Union in the aftermath of the Second World War and the global order that built up in that time, with the United States being the preponderant power and really lending its newfound role in leading the world to developing institutions and what we call now this rules-based global order. And I think what I'm proposing to you in terms of an inflection point is that order that we thought we knew is now kind of in a shambles, and that's through a combination of things that are interesting and worth discussing. But for our purposes, I think it's fair to say that the old order, in which the nuclear order and nuclear weapons and their role in the international system is changing in important ways. And so a lot of what we thought we knew about the role of nuclear weapons is now being recast.
So let me ask you, many people talk about we have a three body problem. The Cold War legacy is no longer relevant. And I've been thinking about it because somebody mentioned that this idea of a three body problem and said, well, do we really have one? And as I've thought about it, I've wondered, I would aspire to sort of this view of, I think you guys have written about it at CGSR, this idea of cross domain deterrence, that's a growing challenge, that we have, that tailored deterrence is important now. But for the challenge of, is it a three body problem? I still think it's probably a two body problem because of the sort of the nature of the challenge. And that is, while Russia has different history, different interests, different culture, different strategic culture than China, you still have two dictators, two authoritarians with similar regimes that have, in some respects, very similar interests. Authoritarians want to stay in power. They sort of look at they both want to essentially topple the Western led, American created international system. So there's enough commonalities that for the United States, to me, it seems like it's still a two body problem instead of being a very distinct three body problem, even if Russia, China, North Korea, potentially Iran are very different as countries and cultures and peoples. Am I looking at this the wrong way? Is there something I'm missing?
Well, I think part of the inflection point is uh, is the understanding that the deterrence architecture and the force posture that we developed throughout the Cold War was was almost entirely focused on deterrence against the Soviet Union, and we rolled that over when and we rolled that over to Russia, and that seemed to be and I'm going to introduce this always a tricky term, but stability, right? But that there was a sense that deterrence, uh, had survived and made the transition, and that the United States and Russia were still in this kind of bipolar deterrence relationship. Over those years, and there was an interim transitional period from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so that was the post Cold War era, and now we're in the post Cold War era, or some would say post Cold War era. And one of the things that uh, people in the government in particular, but scholars as well, were hesitant to accept is nuclear deterrence with China as a peer competitor. Right, our arsenal wasn't designed that way, and our theories weren't designed that way. And we've been resisting that, and it was never sort of officially sanctioned that we were in a second bilateral nuclear deterrence relationship with Beijing, and that is now changing, right? So that's your another N body, right? So then you add to that the complexity, right? I mean, this is the underlying problem, is that the complexities start to really snowball on you, because then you look at Russia, China, and their ongoing rivalry, and what the appearance or the assertion of their being in an alliance, and what that really means. But anyone who knows their history knows that doesn't go very far. Um, and so now they're deterring each other in some way. But now let's add India into the mix, right? So there's the India-China dynamic, and that now has been fully nuclearized. And then the daisy chain quickly moves to Pakistan, India, and Pakistan's relationship with China. So these are all nuclear states in a competitive relationship. Um, and while we are not viewing India and Pakistan as necessarily nuclear rivals, it certainly adds levels of complexity to these, major deterrence relationships that we are focused on. And you might say the same thing about North Korea. Are we in a nuclear deterrence relationship? So when people talk about North Korea and they say, well, you just have, there's no chance of denuclearization. You're just going to have to face it, right? That it is what it is and it ain't going nowhere. And Kim Jong-un and his regime are not going anywhere. So maybe their weapons are really for deterrence. And maybe if we leave them be, we can have some sort of a deterrence relationship. Well, you could add on to that pile the Iranians, and people are also saying, well, didn't work trying to walk back their program. We lost the JCPOA. They're moving forward. Everyone knows it. Maybe deterrence will work, right? Maybe we're in a deterrence relationship with the Iranians. So the point that I'm making about the inflection point is that the theories about nuclear deterrence are all kind of my age. They're old, and they came from the 50s and 60s and 70s. So when we think about Bernard Brodie and the absolute weapon, and Albert Holstetter and the delicate balance of terror, and Herman Kahn and escalation ladders, and Thomas Schelling and the whole game theory approach to our field, when you add all these other actors, the n-body problem becomes, at some point it overwhelms the understanding that we thought we had. I mean, that's just at least my opinion of where we are today. And the good side of that is, I think that we are right now enjoying a bit of a little renaissance in nuclear theories and nuclear thought, in that people really are having to go back to the drawing board in a positive way and say, well, what does complexity mean for nuclear deterrence, and what do you have to do to deter in this kind of an environment where you've got many more actors and a lot more uncertainty, volatility, contentiousness. I would add to that one of the other fundamental building blocks of our deterrence theories was, that stability meant you would not be threatening nuclear use, right? That if you had a stable deterrence relationship, all the actors would understand that there was too much at stake to be making nuclear threats. Well, that turns out to be wrong as well. So another building block in our wall has kind of dissolved in front of us, leaving us wondering, well, Putin says he's going to use them. North Korea is making nuclear threats. President Xi says he's going to have the biggest arsenal in 10 years. These are not the kind of things that go along with the sort of, stability that we used to see as the kind of primary objective of nuclear deterrence. So, it's a new world. I would say that it's far more complex than what we've known in the past.
This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. Yeah, that seems definitely the case. That and as you guys have written about in terms of cross domain, if you can achieve an effect on in cyberspace that has a similar destructive force in terms of, let's say, using a cyber attack to shut down PNT, or to shut down electric grids, or shut down whatever, that then ripples across a country's society and can cause mass casualty, chaos. Or if you take out space and you take out PNT, and the electric grid shuts down from that, and the bank shut down, and all these ripple effects can you deter that with nuclear? Or so when you talk about complexity, these new domains, and just saying, well, how do I deter that? And if I get an attack in this domain, can I use this other domain, or is that, how does that work? So those complexities certainly seem to be there. How are you thinking about, because this is one of those areas where, I don't think we have sort of a con escalation ladder where you can say, well, a cyber attack of this significance, equates to a nuclear strike with this many weapons of this, of this yield, or a space attack. We don't really have that yet. We've never really had a cyber war, so it's hard to say, how do you respond? We've never had a space war, so we don't have, it's sort of like the bombing survey after World War II, where you had all these theories about air power. And then after you use it, you then get to go in and look at what happened and say, well, we were kind of wrong about these things. We've not been able to do that in space and cyber. So how are y'all thinking about, and how are you thinking about this whole relationship of domains and new ones, and working them into the, the escalation ladder, or however you're thinking about them? What are you doing?
Yeah, well, I mean that's so that's the big challenge, right? So the domains, right, have always kind of been there, but now they've been broken out as major areas of military, political, and economic competition. And what you're saying, Adam, is absolutely right. Is these domains are entangled, and so this entanglement of the domains means that you can't really do domain specific deterrence. That is, nuclear to nuclear, chem to chem, bio to bio, cyber to cyber. Space stays in space. Um, Everything is so entangled, right? And particularly when we're talking about cyber and space, where they're not only entangled with, military applications crossing over from nuclear to conventional, but they're entangled with civilian infrastructure, right? So, you're faced with a real problem of proportionality and response in kind, right? You're not going to probably respond to a cyber attack with a nuclear weapon. You're probably, you get the point. And so you have to think about all of these capabilities kind of in concert, right? And that's where cross domain complex deterrence requires that you have I'm getting an image of like the man behind the curtain in the Wizard of Oz, or what people call the mighty Wurlitzer, a machine with lots of levers and dials, and so what people are trying to think about now, are like how to turn the dial up in the right area to get the right sound, right? And a lot of this comes, if you're talking about deterrence, you're talking about signaling, right? You're not necessarily doing it right off the bat. You're probably signaling your enemy, like, yeah, the consequences of you doing those kinds of things will bring, very unpalatable consequences for you, right? So you want to think twice before you do these sorts of things. But that's where people are now. But what's really interesting from a nuclear standpoint is that you're working with an arsenal that came from this other time of history, right? And there's the unique history of the Cold War itself, and then the post-Cold War period when the U.S. and Russian arsenals were greatly reduced, and we had cooperative threat reduction, and arms control played a big role in finding this kind of stable balance. And all of that seems to be blown out of the water, right? That this old arsenal that we've been polishing and keeping, ready, sort of, but maybe in the way that you you on a Sunday you go out and polish your '67 Impala, and do some, change the spark plugs and get it ready for, the parade day. So we've got these, really cool classic cars. Um, but maybe that's if if you were opening up your mind to think, is that, and the term is fit for purpose, right? Is this the right tool for the job given the current circumstances? And that gets into the controversies that we're having these days, which is, with the arms control and disarmament folks saying, oh, they're going back to Brody and the absolute weapon, right? One would be enough, right? Everyone knows that. You don't need, for this fit for purpose, to be calibrated, to these complex threats. Making a couple of nuclear threats, you're done. Whereas others would say, and you saw this new congressional mandated study come out a couple weeks ago, where there was a very broad consensus, and this was amongst people from both sides of the aisle and with different histories, agreeing that the current arsenal, that '67 Chevy Impala was not going to compete in the world as it exists, and that with Russia moving ahead aggressively to develop its own new weapons, and weapons that they believe are, fit for their current purposes, and China going big in a way that 10 years ago people uh, thought was probably unlikely, but that has come to pass, and with other actors coming into play with the ability to to reach the United States in theory and in practice. Maybe this old arsenal uh, needs something more, right? And so that's where we are today. To answer your question, uh, the nuclear part of this uh, needs needs to be fully represented, and the other domains uh, can't compensate, right, for the nuclear deterrence parts of this. And so, you can't compensate with cyber. You can't compensate with space. You can't, and this is where it gets really interesting and complicated. You can't really compensate with conventional, although that is something we've been, very interested in trying to do. You can't compensate only with defenses, and so there is a thought that uh, the arsenal that we have now is not necessarily fit for purpose.
Yeah, it's you bring up a good point, and when you talk about stability's been one of those things that's always bugged me, because as I hear people writing about strategic stability, I've never seen a really good definition. I've never really seen a way to objectively measure strategic stability. But what I do hear a lot of is this idea of that, well, you, the people I disagree with, whatever you want to do, that's destabilizing. And whatever I want to do is stabilizing. And just take my word for it. And that kind of thinking about stability is really not helpful. I want a very, you know, significant definition that I can then effectively measure. And I don't see that. That's something I don't see. Do you and so that my question one is, do you think that sort of objective measure and definition exists? And then my second question is it sounds like what you're saying is that the psychological effect of nuclear weapons that is sort of hypothesized in prospect theory, where they say humans they overvalue losses and undervalue gains, that sort of holds true still, and that nuclear weapons are that loss that people just say, I can't go there yet. And then, is that what you're saying, which then leads me to my final question, which is, the former Secretary of Defense, who shall not be named because of his, his lack of popularity, who once said, weakness is provocative. And do you think that that's a statement that holds true in sort of the strategic environment we're moving into? And I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, let's cut to the chase, right? Let's go to the heart of deterrence. What is deterrence, and what makes it successful, or what makes deterrence fail? And at the heart of it is, as you're suggesting, fear, right? So it appeals to what we assume to be a basic human quality that people individually and collectively, which matters, right? When you're talking about, Kim Jong-un, who probably cares more about himself than his people, or in the United States, where we really do have the well-being of our people and our country first and foremost. So the assumption is that deterrence works because people want to survive. They want to continue. And therefore, logically, rationally, right, the rational actor would not do things that he or she believed would bring about, the end of their existence, the end of their country, the end of their family, the end of their life, at whatever level of analysis you want to take it to, right? But it applies, right? And so I guess the good news would be that hasn't changed, right? We're still banking on that, right? Deterrence in the modern context still banks on, fear of death, and fear of losing everything that you value, and so, I mean, that is also the heart of the paradox, right? The stability instability paradox that you're referring to here. Whereas, stability comes from threats. Stability comes from threats to do the unthinkable. All right. Stability doesn't necessarily come from an equal balance, right? Stability comes from the assured outcomes. And to make sure that you have assured outcomes, sometimes, you have to develop capabilities that the adversary is uncomfortable with, right? You don't want everybody to be comfortable. You want everybody to be fearful. And so that, stability comes from instability, from making these sorts of threats. And that gets to the heart of, what deters, right? What kind of an arsenal would you need to persuade multiple actors, right? So maybe you need, and this is the point you brought up earlier about tailored deterrence, right? Maybe you need a specific deterrent crafted to Putin's mind and to Russia. Maybe you need a different kind of deterrent crafted towards China and Xi and the PLA and their aspirations. And maybe you need a different kind of deterrent that is takes into account the things that are valued by your adversary. And this is what my colleague and the director of CGSR talks a lot about: the red theory of victory and the blue theory of victory, right? And that means, red has their own way of thinking about this, and they understand our vulnerabilities. And part of what has happened in this inflection point is that the Russians have taken their measure of our deterrent, and the Chinese have studied us very carefully and taken the measure of us and our deterrent. So they, red, have a theory of victory, and they believe certain things about how far they can push us in the current context, and that's what we're coping with, in Ukraine, and trying to ward off with Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. I would add, the other big part of this is the extended deterrent aspect, right? Which is that part of our crafting of domain specific and country specific deterrence profiles is that we include our allies, and that we offer the nuclear security guarantees to our allies. And of course, it's different in NATO. It requires some different kinds of assurances and probably some different types of weapons. And it's different when we're talking about Japan, because of their specific needs and the specific way that they think about their threats and their security. And with the Republic of Korea, our allies there have their own sense of priorities. Their threat analysis is a little bit different. And so now you're asking to craft a deterrent format that is very different. And then it comes down to what you're working with. And back to the '67 Chevy Impala, maybe you drive that around, right? Maybe we drive our B-52s around and show everybody, hey, we got it. It's cool. But maybe not everyone thinks it's that cool, right? Maybe others would say, that's a piece of junk. So, that stability instability paradox that you're talking about is universal, and yet it's very different in each regional circumstance.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time in the show. But before we go, I wanted to bring out Bob, my genie, and I'll rub my magic lamp. Bob pops out, and as with all previous guests, Bob grants 3 wishes, but only on the subjects we've been talking about. That's Bob's a genie. He can do that. So, for Bob to grant you your 3 wishes, what wishes would you have?
Well, I'll refrain from a more personal objectives and stay within the game. Right, when we're doing war games, right, you can't go outside of the game. Got to stay in the game. So I'll stay in your game. So one would be that we go ahead. The United States goes ahead and modernizes its entire nuclear enterprise. That they're old. If you've been to the lab, people are sometimes surprised, right? Like, wow, this is like a 1950s school. This is like the school I went to in Long Beach. I mean, it needs an upgrade, and we need to rethink, how we do this, and that wish goes to the replacement of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s fabrication equipment to more modern methods, right? And we've got to get with the 4th industrial age, right? So I would say that my wish would be that we apply all the best of modern technologies to our nuclear enterprise. That'd be one. 2 would
Okay.
be
Wish number 2.
Wish number 2, that our allies would have confidence in the nuclear security guarantees that we have provided and will continue to offer. And the reason for that, of course, is for those countries that are facing real security dilemmas, right, where they feel threats that they must address to their existence. They have a choice of either going it alone and getting their own nuclear weapons, or trusting us and trusting the security guarantees that we have provided to them. And my wish would be that we would give them the reassurance that they need, and that they would trust us and believe in those assurances rather than go it alone. Because if they go it alone, you'll see the complete, blowout of the nuclear nonproliferation regime, and the problem that we were talking about earlier with the complexity of nuclear weapons relationships throughout the world. It gets a lot worse. So, I think that would be number two, is that extended deterrence survive. And then the third would be that the next generation, the young people who are coming into this field, dedicate themselves and their careers, to grappling with this problem, because you're seeing, for a long time it's been an old white guy thing, and I still, and everyone knows this. If you've been to any meetings, it's really mostly old white guys. And what I would hope is that the future includes, more diversity, and that we make good on these sort of platitude. I mean, often this diversity, equity, inclusion thing that we say is just a nice thing to say, but I think we're going to need all hands on deck, and everybody in our society, lend a hand and be a part of the, grappling with these really hard problems. So I'd say I hope that the nuclear enterprise looks more like America.
Yeah. I mean, it affects, the threats affect us all. So, a nuclear conflict doesn't only kill old white guys. So it's, it's important everybody participates, and,
Right. Exactly.
So, well, thanks. Unfortunately we're out of time. So thanks for joining us, Zach. It was great having you on NucleCast.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Adam. Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode.
This has been a production of the NLA Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Crumple. Help us grow our followers by sharing it, and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast.